you, Senate President. A couple things that the President mentioned that I just want to comment on. You know, I said this wasn't going to be a day about Senate Bill 83, but I have to mention to you as trustees, you're all trustees because you're successful in your own right, whether business, active in the community, not-for-profits, alums of the institutions you serve on. But you're very successful people, and that's great, and we are fortunate to have all of you. One of the things that I would ask you to go back and talk about with your presidents and amongst your boards is President Huffman mentioned, some of the management tools that we have incorporated into 83. We can't ask you to do a better job of monitoring the fiscal performance or making fiscal transparency more of an issue so that we know how you're doing and what you're doing with the funds we give you. $2.7 billion a year, plus capital of another $500 million. So we're not talking chump change here. These are serious taxpayer dollars. But we're trying to actually help the presidents and the boards have more ability to manage costs and things and to change priorities when necessary. You know, we're having serious discussions in the final stages of getting 83 over the hump on retrenchment issues. Okay, and we need to give you the boards. That's what Senate Bill 83. One of the major tenets of it is to allow to give the board's policy, like Ohio State currently has, to make retrenchment policies. We're not telling you what that retrenchment ought to be, but giving it to the board of directors. I have served on a public and private college board in Ohio, and I've been on public and private boards in the private sector in companies. And one thing I can tell you is that every board sort of runs differently, right? And I'm sure each of your boards run a little differently. Ohio State's different than Bowling Green. Bowling Green's different than Wright State, and so on. And those nuances need to be accounted for, certainly. But there are some common themes that should always be present in how boards operate and how they define their roles. And so our next two speakers are going to talk a little bit about some of their views. We have Armand Alacbay, Senior VP of Strategy for the American Council of Trustees and Alums, and Anna Sillers, who is a Data Analyst Fellow and ACTA Director, who are going to talk to you a little bit about sort of their models. It's not being proposed as the model, but it's something to spur some thinking. Maybe you can make some comparisons to how you guys operate at your boards and what they're suggesting to do here. So please join me in welcoming Armand and Anna to the podium. You go first.
Thank you, Senator Cirinio. First, I just want to recognize how fortunate you are in Ohio to have leaders in your legislature like President Huffman and Senator Cirinio, who have higher education at the forefront of their policy portfolios. That really just makes your job as trustees so much easier. As most, if not all, of you who are serving on boards have come to realize now, one of the first things is that you notice when you volunteer to serve on this board, aside from the not so infrequent reminders to contribute to the University Capital campaign, is that you have to learn a brand new language in order to get anything done. Academic freedom, regional accreditation, tuition discounting. And I cannot overstate just how important it is and how valuable it is to have leaders, lawmakers on your side who are conversant, if not fluent, in this language. So hats off to your colleagues here in the legislature. What I want to do this morning is give you a framework for thinking about the rest of the day. Why all of these discussion topics are important to your job as a trustee, but also why your job itself is important. Look, there are a lot of fun parts to being a board member, right? You know, the football games, you have the people you meet, the cocktail hours. But it's a very important job. It's a critical job, I'd say, for the state of Ohio, but also for American competitiveness. So let's start by putting that job in context. There are about 1,500 public and private not-for-profit colleges and universities in the United States. It's about 23,000 board members nationwide, including most everyone here in this room. Conservatively, there are about 15 million students on campus across the country. So do the math. This means that on average, each of you individually is responsible for the futures of 650 young men and women. Their lifetimes are in your hands. And I'm not even talking about the Ohio taxpayers that also support these institutions financially, about $6,200 per student. But beyond the economic impact of higher education, you're also producing the next generation of civic leaders. So you also have to pay attention to things like civic education and modeling the free exchange of ideas, which we'll be talking about more this afternoon. Don't take my word for it, though. Take it from the 22 national higher education leaders who signed the Governance for a New Era statement, copies of which we have in the back there. I highly encourage you to take a copy of this home. Read it again, and discuss it with your president and with your other colleagues on the board. If there's one practical next step you can take after today that will help you frame your board operations so that your time is consistently spent on meaningful, high-leverage discussion, not getting too deep in the weeds, but also not hovering too superficially, this would be it. A mutually aligned understanding of how your board partners with your president is one of the largest predictors of your board service being meaningful, hands down. Now, before I turn this over to my colleague, there are two other takeaways I want you to leave here with as you continue this morning. And the first is, you know more than you think you do. You were chosen for this job for a reason. And it's not just to give to the capital campaign. Okay, partially it's because to give to the capital campaign. But in all seriousness, what gets in the way most often of board members being optimally engaged is when they underestimate what they bring to the table at board meetings and at committee meetings. This is most evident when it comes to academic policy. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about micromanaging what happens in the classroom or getting involved with things like syllabi. But pretty much everyone here either is currently or has been an employer. And in that capacity, you've probably hired some college graduates or recent college graduates at some point. So you already have expectations of what the core competencies are that college graduates should have when entering the workforce. They need to be able to analyze and solve problems they've never seen before. They need to be able to work with people of diverse backgrounds and perspectives. And sometimes they need to be creative enough to figure out what the answer is when it's not right in front of them. Think of it this way. As trustees, you're signing off on a diploma that signals to the world the capacities and the potential of each graduate who carries that degree. The rigor of your graduation requirements is your brand. So what can you do as a board member? ACTA has a website we call What Will They Learn at whatwilltheylearn.com. Here we look at the general education requirements of over 1,100 colleges and universities, and we rate them according to how many of 7 core subjects they require: literature, composition, mathematics, foreign language, US history or government, natural science, and economics. We drill down and look at every course in the catalog to make sure that every course that meets your institution's graduation requirements also meets exacting college-level standards of rigor. Because remember, if there's anyone out there who's going to find that course on zombies and pop culture that checks off the box, it's going to be an entrepreneurial 19-year-old undergraduate. I know this because I may have done the same thing when I was a 19-year-old undergraduate. So why do we do all of this? Why does ACTA produce materials like this for boards? Because all the skills I just talked about, problem solving and the like, those all go back to the liberal arts. See, your college major is really helpful for getting your first job, but it's the totality of your college education that puts you in a position to succeed long-term in the workforce and beyond. A Bureau of Labor Statistics survey in 2021 found that the average person changed jobs 12 times between the ages of 18 and 54. And that was for the baby boomer generation. Now, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but Gen Z seems to have a much different view of job longevity at a particular company. So there are a lot of other topics that I'm happy to talk about with you offline, such as the National Survey of Student Engagement. That will tell you things like what percentage of students have ever been required at your institution to write a 10-page paper, ever. But the point here is, you know more than you think about the educational mission. So please apply that knowledge. The second takeaway I want you to have is, you still need to know more than what you do know. And what I mean by that is, no matter what your background is, you're a CEO, a lawyer, civic leader, anyone, it is impossible to get an adequate handle on everything you need to know to add full value to your board meetings just by reading the board deck beforehand. This is particularly true on the financial side of the ball, which probably sounds counterintuitive because that's probably your area of professional expertise. And that's because higher ed finance is just different. You have all of these revenue streams that have their own rules, whether it's tuition, fees, state support, private philanthropy, research grants. You have a pricing model that just doesn't make sense. We don't even use CPI when we talk about inflation. We have our own inflation index, the HEPI index. And so I think about what's going on at West Virginia University. Now, I don't need to get into the particulars about this. I'm sure you've read about this. You know about the nearly 30 academic programs at risk. You know about the $45 million shortfall. You know about the projections on enrollment growth that just didn't come to fruition. Now, let me be very, very clear here. Even with hindsight being 20/20, I can't stand up here and tell you exactly what the board should have done to avoid this. I can't even tell you that there even was anything, that this could have been avoided at all. But you see, that's the scary part. I mean, put yourself in the position 4, 5, 6 years ago on that board. You're signing off on a strategic plan with full confidence that enrollment growth would keep up the way that you thought it would. And yet here we are. And so I think with that, trustees across the country should all have a healthy sense of unease about the sustainability of their institution's economic model. I'm sure you know about the enrollment cliff. The college-age population will drop by 15% between 2025 and 2029. We're already here. 150,000 fewer students attending regional four-year institutions by 2029. And yet every trustee that I talk to across the country says the same thing. We're going to buck the trend. We're different from the nation. What I'm really saying here is that governing effectively requires asking constructive questions. I have a few on the slide up right here. We don't need to go into each of them individually. But take, for instance, something like classroom utilization. What does it look like by the time of day and the day of the week? That's a big factor alone when you talk about the costs of capital projects, that capital campaign again, and long-term maintenance. Here we have a study from Ohio State where you'll notice that classroom utilization at 3:30 in the afternoon goes from 80 to 90% midweek down to 2/3 on Fridays, where that there's a drop-off in room usage starting at 4:30 p.m. Now, that being said, these are actually pretty good compared to most other public universities. A solid 40-hour week is very rare to see anywhere. But I mention this because this is something that it's just kind of a sniff test question you can ask. And it has not only just financial implications, but it also sets the example to students for what a work week is supposed to look like once they leave college. There's a major state university, not in Ohio, and it will remain nameless today, whose board strategic plan during that peak time of 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., admitting that the reason was because that's just what faculty and students wanted. Boards, you have to do better than that. So with that, I want to turn this over to my colleague, Anna Sillers. She directs ACTA's How Colleges Spend Money initiative. We created this website to give trustees like you access to independent information on university spending trends in a way that is useful to you, that is outside the language of policy wonks.
Thank you, Armand. As Armand said, I am the director of ACTA's How Colleges Spend Money site. One of the reasons that we started How Colleges Spend Money is because tuition and college spending have been so out of control. As most of you have seen in the news, tuition is at some of its highest levels. Student debt is rising, and despite this, graduation rates are still incredibly low. The most recent graduation rate for four-year public schools was 42%. And for all schools, both public and private, the graduation rate was 47%. So this means the majority of undergraduates will not graduate in 4 years, despite the high rates of spending that we have seen. In 2019, we created How Colleges Spend Money, a site designed for trustees to better understand their institution's spending levels. We used 10 years of data from the Department of Education, so trustees for any of the 1,500 schools included could see how their tuition, spending, and graduation rates compare to their peers. Other data points include financial aid information, enrollment breakdowns, and retention rates alongside graduation rates. After creating How Colleges Spend Money, in 2021, we used the same data featured on the site to publish a paper called The Cost of Excess, where we examined how spending is associated with outcomes. We were especially focused on graduation rates and tuition increases for students. We found that for all of the types of spending that we looked at had a very minimal correlation with graduation rates. We also found that all of the types of spending we looked at are associated with increases in the following year's tuition, even after controlling for state appropriations. We hope trustees will keep this in mind when looking into their institution's spending levels. As with all of the graphs I will show you today, you can find the full paper on howcollegesspendmoney.com, and we also have a few copies in the back. I used the site to create a comparison chart of the 4 schools in Ohio with the most undergraduate students. This chart is administrative spending per student adjusted for inflation. The reason the background changes in color is because the Department of Education changed the survey in 2016. So data in the last 5 years should not be compared to data previous to 2016. Whenever there is a large change year to year, like there is with Ohio State and the University of Cincinnati, it typically means there was a change in how the data was classified by the Institutional Research Office. We encourage all trustees to be knowledgeable with how your institution classifies its data and any changes that an institution may make when uploading data to the Department of Education. While I included 4 schools in this chart for the sake of efficiency, I do want to stress I am not trying to pit any of these schools against each other. As you will see in a second, trustees will have a better sense of their spending when compared to their institution's peers, which are not necessarily the other 3 schools in this chart. Instructional spending is more consistent for all 4 schools, and for most of the schools in the chart has been decreasing. Instructional spending is essentially all professor, lecturer, adjunct salaries, and typically is much larger than administrative spending per student. The most recent graph we added to the site is student services. Student services spending is a little less self-explanatory than instructional or administrative spending. Student services are any funds dedicated to a student's intellectual, cultural, and social development outside of formal instruction. So these are activities like cultural events, student newspapers, career counseling, and intramural sports. Going back to what I said earlier, we encourage trustees to compare their spending to their peers and to also know and reflect on who their peers are. I have Ohio State in this graph, as well as Ohio State's peers on the left. So these are similar institutions that a university typically chooses for themselves. If an institution neglects to select a peer group, the Department of Education will create the peer group for a school instead. The purple line in the graph is the average per student spending of the peers. I encourage trustees to use the site to see which schools your institution considers peers. This is a look at how Ohio State's instructional spending compares to its peers. And again, Ohio State is in green and the peers are in purple. To give a little more context, we looked at a few other flagship schools. LSU spends about $14,000 per student on instruction, while the University of Texas spends about $27,000 per student. And lastly, this is Ohio State's student services spending, how student services spending compares to their peers. Student services tends to be the lowest spending compared to administrative and instruction, but it is one of the fastest growing types of spending according to data from the past 10 years. While I have focused on spending, we do have other features on the site, including tuition as a percentage of median household income, and graduation rates. We are also open to any additional features that trustees may find useful. So we hope that you will look into your own institution or alma mater's spending patterns using howcollegesspendmoney.com. Thank you so much for your time. I have my email on the site up here right now if you have any questions or additions to the site.